Okay, so neuropharm first. First of all, let's talk about major neurotransmitters, right? In the nervous system and what they do, or where they are located, what they do. Now we're going to link that to neuropath, right? So what pathologies can affect, right? Those neurotransmitters. And then we're going to talk about how we're going to treat, right? Those conditions properly. So starting first with, so let me just list as much as I can remember first before we start talking about them. Acetylcholine, glutamate, Gaba, right? Gaba and glycine almost the same kind of function, so you can classify them together. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, catecholamines, dopamine, right? Dopamine. Yeah, all right. So starting with acetylcholine, where do we normally see acetylcholine anatomically? Because they can link that, right, to neuroanatomy. Which cells make acetylcholine? Typically, the minutes, right, or cells of minutes, for them minutes nucleus, right? So cells of minutes or the nucleus of minutes. That is why you usually have a lot of cholinergic neurons. You get it? So,
Yes, sir.
and which pathology is related to low acetylcholine in the nervous system?
The Alzheimer's.
Alzheimer's. So in
Yes, sir.
Alzheimer's, acetylcholine will be low. And from the way Alzheimer's presents, it can give you an idea of how, right? Sorry, what the function of acetylcholine is. Does that make sense? The way they present, they have loss of executive function. There's memory problem, right? They have problem with spatial field and navigation, right? Things like that. So basically, that tells me acetylcholine plays a major role in memory, plays a major role in executive function, calculation, right? Navigation, things like that. Yes. So that's important. And in patients with Alzheimer's, where they have low acetylcholine, it means the objective of our treatment will be towards to increase, right, the levels of acetylcholine, right, in the nervous system, in the brain.
Yeah.
And so, what class of drugs can we use to do this? What class of drugs will increase acetylcholine concentration in the brain?
Yeah, acetylcholinesterase inhibitors.
So, acetylcholinesterase enzyme, right, inhibitors.
Yes.
Right. So cholinesterase enzyme breaks down, right? Acetylcholine.
Yeah.
Makes sense. While
Yes.
acetylcholinesterase enzyme inhibitors will increase. So the drugs are handling what stigmines, right? Stigmines. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
You can use any of the stigmines except neostigmine. You can use predostigmine, physostigmine. What is unique about neostigmine is that neostigmine has what? No CNS entry. So neostigmine does not enter the central nervous system. So it's going to be useless, right? In someone with Alzheimer's, where the problem is actually in the brain. Does that make sense? So
Yes, sir.
neostigmine will be useless, right? Where you can use any of the stigmines, inhibit acetylcholinesterase enzyme, and that will increase acetylcholine concentration, and that helps in Alzheimer's. Okay. Another treatment we can use, actually in advanced cases of Alzheimer's, another treatment we can use is going to be memantine. So what is the gross pathology of the brain in patients with Alzheimer's? If you check their brain, what will you see?
But there will be atrophy of
There will be
the
atrophy, right, of the cerebral cortex.
So,
Why do you think there's atrophy of the cerebral cortex in Alzheimer's? Why would the brain look smaller in size? What is the brain normally made up of? Neurons. So why will
yes,
it be small? Why will it shrink? If there's
if you have
loss of
disruption of
neurons,
neurons.
right? Alzheimer's is a word, neurodegenerative, right? Disease.
Okay.
Does it make sense?
Yes, sir.
Alzheimer's is a neurodegenerative disease. So if we block Right, Alzheimer's is a neurodegenerative disease. So we block, if there are progressive loss of neurons in the brain, then the brain undergoes atrophy, right? Yeah, in that case. And that will contribute, there will be loss of cholinergic neurons, and that contributes to acetylcholinesterase deficiency in the central nervous system and contributes to the signs and symptoms we're going to see, right, in Alzheimer's disease, right?
Yes.
Now, the memantine is a NMDA, right? Glutamate receptor inhibitor. Memantine is a drug that inhibits NMDA receptor, which is glutamate receptor. The reason this is important is because NMDA receptor is a calcium channel. Whenever NMDA is activated, right, or glutamate activates NMDA in excess, calcium, there will be excess calcium influx into the neurons, and that can lead to what? Can lead to apoptosis, death of the neurons. So stimulation of this NMDA receptor by glutamate contributes to what? To the death of neurons, right, in patients with Alzheimer's and cerebral atrophy. So that is why we can give memantine, a drug that will block NMDA receptor, and that will decrease the excitotoxicity, right, of neurons and slow down the progressive loss of neurons and also slow down cerebral atrophy, right, in these patients.
Yes.
Does it make sense? You get this?
Yes.
Right. So this is super important. Okay. So that is going to be the link, right? Acetylcholine, we know where it's going to be anatomically in the brain. We know the disease associated and we understand the principle of treatment, right, of Alzheimer's by targeting acetylcholine, okay, as well as preventing neuron death. Okay. Now, glutamate, right? So that's one. Glutamate is what? Is it excitatory or inhibitory neurotransmitter?
Excitatory.
Excitatory.
Yes.
Glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. And glutamate has two major types of receptors. It has the metabotropic receptors, or the ones that are we call so-called non-NMDA receptors. And it also has what? NMDA, right? Receptors. And NMDA receptors, they are unique in such a sense that they have two gates. Remember the NMDA question that we saw testing this principle? NMDA receptors have two gates. They are voltage gated, right? As well as gated by magnesium. Excellent. So that is why glutamate needs to activate the metabotropic receptors to depolarize the cell. And then the depolarization will displace magnesium, right? And completely open, right? NMDA receptors. Excellent. Good. Yeah. Yes, and NMDA receptors are basically calcium channels, right? They are calcium channels. They allow calcium into the cell. And if calcium enters, the membrane becomes depolarized, right? Yeah. And that will lead to stimulation of the neurons or neuron excitation. Yeah. Yes. But the problem with excess of that excitation, right, is toxic. If neurons are excited in excess, activate apoptosis, right? And that will lead to neuronal death. Yes. Okay. All right. So now, what kind of conditions do we associate pathologies can we associate with maybe having excess glutamate activity? Of course, it is an excitatory neurotransmitter. Imagine if there's something wrong with glutamate receptors and neurons are firing in excess. That can lead to conditions like seizure, right? Or epilepsy, where there will be focus on excess neuronal activity. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yes, sir. So, and that is why some of the drugs that we use to treat seizure and epilepsy, they are drugs that block glutamate receptors. So we can treat with drugs that inhibit, right, glutamate receptors or target NMDA and stuff like that, or modulate some of the glutamate receptors. Yeah, or modulate excitatory neurons, sort of. So we can use that to kind of treat seizure activity, right, or use it to treat epilepsy. On the other hand, if we have conditions that are decreasing the activity of glutamate, then that can lead to sleepiness, comatose state, right? Lethargy, where patients have depressed, right? Mental status. Yeah. Yes, sir. Okay, so it's excitatory, right? And the memantine blocks the receptor to prevent excess neuronal loss in conditions like Alzheimer's or neurodegenerative, right, disease. Okay, so that would be glutamate. Gaba and glycine, what are they? Excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters. Inhibitory. So GABA and glycine. Glycine typically is the inhibitory neurotransmitter in the spinal cord, but it can also work in the brain. GABA can also work in the spinal cord, but mostly right in the brain. Yeah, that's where it works, and the cerebellum. That's where it mostly works. So of course, GABAergic receptor. We have two major right GABAergic receptor we should know for your exam. We have what GABA A, right, and GABA B. Does that make sense? Yeah. If GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter and the channels are ion channels, the receptors are linked to an ion channel or ion gated receptors. They are linked to ion channels, which means for GABA to inhibit neurons, it has to what? It has to hyperpolarize the neuron, right? Basically make the cell membrane, right, more negative.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Make the
Yes,
cell
sir.
membrane more negative. Yeah. So, which means GABA A has to be what? Has to be a chloride channel, while GABA B is a what? Potassium channel. Because if I open a chloride channel on the membrane of neurons, what happens to chloride? Chloride will enter, right? The cell. There's chloride outside. I open a chloride channel, chloride enters the cell, the membrane becomes what? Hyperpolarized, more negative, and the neurons will fire less. If I open GABA B, there's more potassium inside the cell than outside. If I open GABA B, potassium leaves. Does that make sense? The neurons, and that will what hyperpolarize the neurons, so making more negative and inhibits, right? Neurons, yeah.
Yes, sir.
Good. So we have drugs that can work right on these receptors. For GABA B, the common drug that works on this is baclofen, right? Of GABA B. Why for GABA A, there are a lot of drugs that work on GABA B. Benzo, barbiturate, alcohol, right? Yeah, definitely modulates, right? GABA B receptor, among other things. So the CNS suppression that we're going to see with benzo, with barbiturate, with alcohol, right, is due to stimulation of inhibitory, right, neurotransmitter, which makes sense.
Yes.
And that's why when there's withdrawal, right, there's a problem, right? Yeah, there will be excess CNS stimulation at that point, opposite. We can use benzos, barbiturate to treat what? To treat seizures. So somebody with seizure is somebody that likely has imbalance between what? Excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters, where there's excess glutamate activity, for instance, and there's decreased, right, GABAergic, right, activity. So we can restore balance by what? Blocking glutaminergic neurons and stimulating what? GABAergic neurons, right? To kind of restore balance. So we can use benzos to treat status epilepticus or seizure disorder, right? Seizures from alcohol withdrawal, and use benzos to treat those, things like that. We can use like drugs like baclofen to treat what? To treat spasticity. Patients with upper motor neuron symptoms, brain damage, they have excess peripheral excitability. All right, we can suppress those by giving what? Baclofen, which also suppress, right, the central nervous system. Yeah.
Yes.
So GABA super right, important. Yeah. Which pathology affects GABAergic neurons in the caudate nucleus? So because we have GABAergic neurons in the caudate nucleus, which are also what? They are neurons that inhibit, right, movement, to help us modulate movement, right? Yeah, they have inhibition effect of movement. And the pathology that can affect these GABAergic neurons in the caudate nucleus of what? Is Huntington, right? Huntington's disease.
Yes.
Does this make sense? Huntington. In Huntington, patient has what? A mutation on chromosome 4, and they have what? Trinucleotide repeats of what? CAG. CAG repeat. And what happens is the CAG repeat is gonna destroy, right, the GABAergic neurons in the caudate nucleus, and patient will have what? Excess movement, because GABA is inhibitory. So if there's no inhibition of movement, there will be excess, unopposed, right? Excess movement. And that's why they have the words, the hyper, right? Kinesics, on non-rhythmic movement of the extremities and stuff like that. Yeah. So based on these pathophysiologies now, what do you think we can do to treat? Huntington. How can we treat? Based on this pathophysiology of Huntington's disease, how can we treat, theoretically speaking? Tell me in terms of receptors, what receptor would I target and what would I use to those receptors? I'm not asking about drugs itself. What will you do to treat Huntington based on this pathophysiology of the condition? What do you say the problem is in Huntington?
The problem is we have Gaba inhibition. So we have
loss
yes.
of GABAergic neurons. Okay,
Right.
so how can I? So why do they have excess movements? Why do they present with hyperkinesis?
Because there's overstimulation of the excitatory, but unopposed stimulation of the excitatory neurons.
Okay, so how can I treat Huntington based on that pathophysiology?
We could block the stimulatory neurons.
Block stimulatory neurons, or
or we could increase the activation of Gaba.
Or we can give Gaba or increase Gaba.
Yes, sir.
Whether we're blocking inhibitory neurons, so stimulatory neurons, or we'll increase the activity of what inhibitory, right? Neurons. Does that make sense or not?
Yes, makes sense.
Right. So in the basal ganglia, because something called nucleus is where in the basal ganglia, correct? GABA is inhibitory neurotransmitter. Which neurotransmitters are stimulatory? Or which neurotransmitter is stimulatory in the basal ganglia? Dopamine, right? Dopamine and glutamate.
Okay. Yes, sir.
In the basal ganglia, GABA and acetylcholine are what? Inhibitory neurotransmitters in the basal ganglia, while dopamine and glutamate are what? Stimulatory neurotransmitters in the basal ganglia. So how can I treat Huntington disease? Either I'm increasing acetylcholinergic activity, GABAergic neurons are already destroyed, they're not going to work anymore. So it's either if they're able to get GABA into the brain, if I can do that, that would be nice. If I can do what? If I can increase acetylcholine, right? Concentration also, yeah, in the basal ganglia. Or if I can block dopamine, right? Or block glutamate receptors. That may help, right? With Huntington disease.
Yes, sir.
Does this make sense?
Yes, it does.
Right. So we have what? Which class of drugs have antidopaminergic activities? What class of drugs block dopamine? So we want to block dopamine receptors. Those are going to be what? Antipsychotics, right? Antipsychotics are antidopaminergic drugs, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Antipsychotics are antidopaminergic drugs. So they block what? They block dopamine receptors in the basal ganglia, and that will help, right, with the hyperkinesis that people with Huntington disease usually have. Good. And then if I also block dopamine, I can or block target glutamate. Memantine may be beneficial, right, in someone with Huntington. By blocking glutaminergic receptors, that may decrease, right, the excess movement also, right? Yeah, in the basal ganglia. It's possible. There's also a class of drug we call tetrabenazine. Like tetrabenazine, just like tetrabenazine, they inhibit the release of dopamine by dopaminergic neurons. So that also have the same effect, right? Decrease dopaminergic activity in the basal ganglia, and that helps with the excess movement, right? We're going to see in Huntington disease.
Okay.
Is this clear?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. What about epinephrine and norepinephrine? What are their function? What do they do normally?
They think they're stimulatory, alpha and beta.
So alpha and beta, epinephrine, norepinephrine, they are part of which nervous system? Part of what nervous system?
That will be sympathetic.
They are part of the sympathetic, right? Sympathetic nervous system. Does that make sense? They are part of the sympathetic nervous system. Good. So let's start with where are they made? Source. What will be the source of epinephrine? The major source of epinephrine is what?
I don't know.
Where are they made for? Adrenal medullary. The major source of epinephrine is adrenal medullary. Where is the major source of norepinephrine? Norepinephrine will be made by what? By the sympathetic neurons. It's mostly made by the sympathetic neurons. And about 20% or so is coming from what? Adrenal medullary. But epinephrine, all of the epinephrine in the body, right? They're typically coming from adrenal medulla, right? Because the neurons or the nerve terminals, sympathetic nerve terminals, they don't have the enzyme, right, to synthesize epinephrine.
Yes, sir.
And we make epinephrine from what? From norepinephrine, right? We make norepinephrine first, and then we convert norepinephrine to epinephrine through methyltransferase enzyme. Yeah. So that enzyme is typically in the adrenal medulla. It is not found in the nerve terminals of sympathetic neurons. And that's why those neurons rarely make epinephrine. They mostly make norepinephrine. Okay, right. So adrenal medulla mostly, so basically the adrenal medulla is like an endocrine gland, right? Yeah, so adrenal medulla epinephrine. So we need epinephrine to stimulate sympathetic receptors that are uninnervated, right? Because if they don't have nerve, they don't have neurons, which means there's no norepinephrine, right? The only thing that can stimulate them will be what? Epinephrine. Does that make sense? And
yes, sir.
Yeah, the adrenergic receptors that don't have direct innervation, typical example was beta 2 receptor. It's gonna be stimulated usually by what? By epinephrine that is circulating in the blood. So, and they can ask you this, right? Which they're gonna give you an example, a question, experimental question. We remove the adrenal medulla, right, of an animal, right? And the question will be asking you, which of the following receptor will not work in that animal, will not be stimulated? It has to be beta 2. Does this make sense? Right. So we have beta, how many beta receptors? Beta 1, right? Beta 2, right? Beta 3. Beta 2 is uninnervated. It doesn't have a direct, right, nerve stimulating like to that receptor, supplying it. Which means, and what do you say norepinephrine is coming from? Nerve terminals, right? Mostly make norepinephrine, nerve terminals. 20% is coming from the adrenal medulla, but the major source is what? Nerve terminals. Epinephrine is the one that is coming mostly from the adrenal medulla, only actually from the adrenal medulla, epinephrine. Right. So if a receptor doesn't have nerve terminals, right, the only catecholamine that can stimulate the receptor will be what? Epinephrine, not norepinephrine. So beta 1, beta 3, and alpha 1, right, and alpha 2 can be stimulated by both. But beta 2 is stimulated by what? Only epinephrine, because it does not have a direct nerve a direct nerve innervation. Does this make sense? Yeah.
Yes, sir. Makes sense.
Good. Super important. Super. What is the cell signaling pathway for beta receptor? Cell signaling pathway for beta receptors. What is the cell signaling pathway for beta receptors? Which G receptor does beta receptors use? All beta receptors use what? GS. GS, all of them. We know the GS
Yes.
pathway, right? What is the
Yes,
second?
yes.
What is the second messenger in the GS pathway?
Adenoid cyclase.
Adenine cyclase, and that will
Yes.
increase what molecule?
And increase your CAMP.
Cyclic AMP, and cyclic AMP
Yes.
will activate what? Cyclic AMP will activate protein kinase A, right? And protein kinase A will phosphorylate the appropriate enzymes and code, and we're gonna start seeing the effect, right? Yeah, of activating that receptor. Yeah.
Yes.
So beta, all beta are GS. Where is beta 1 found?
It's one brain.
Beta 1, there's no beta 1 in the brain. Where's beta 1 found? Beta 1 is mostly found where? The heart, or the heart and the kidneys. Beta 1 receptor, heart and kidneys. Right?
Yes.
Beta 1 receptor is found in one of the most important organ in the body, which is the kidneys and the heart and the kidneys. Yeah, heart and the kidneys have beta 1. What would be the effect of stimulating beta 1 in the heart? What would be the effect of stimulating beta 1 in the heart?
Decrease.
What would be the effect of stimulating beta 1 in the heart? A sympathetic receptor in the heart. What would be the effect?
Increase heart rate.
Increased heart rate, increased contractility, increased cardiac output, increased stroke volume, increased conduction velocity. Everything goes up, sympathetic, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And what would be the effect of stimulating beta 1 in the kidneys? Renin, right? Renin
Yes,
release. So the effect of stimulating beta 1 in the kidney is release of renin, which will activate RAS and help to maintain blood pressure. Yeah.
Yes.
I need blood pressure. I need proper blood pressure. Basically, so the heart and the kidneys, they control blood pressure, right? Yeah. So, and I need to have an optimal pressure to fight or flight or whatever. Or why will a patient's pressure be high when they are running or fighting, right? Beta 1 activates RAS, increase the cardiac output, increase blood pressure. Excellent. Good.
Yes.
Okay. So where will I find beta 2? Actually, the lungs, beta 2 lungs, as well as what on the vessels. Beta 2 in the lungs, also on what smooth muscles of the vessels, right? Beta 2.
Yes.
Yeah, we also have beta 2 here in the smooth muscles of the uterus. Right. So mostly everywhere, so beta 1 in the heart, beta 3 in the bladder, right? Beta 3 is bladder wall. Everywhere else we have beta receptor, we want beta 2. The airways, the lungs, the smooth muscles of the vessels, smooth muscles of the uterus. Yeah, I think the ciliary epithelium to the eye, beta 2 receptor.
Okay.
What will beta 2 receptor do in the lungs? What will be the function of beta 2 receptor in the lungs?
It will be
Bronchodilation. Very good. Bronchodilation. And the effect in the vessels will be what? Vasodilation. So it basically relaxes smooth muscles, right? Bronchodilation, vasodilation, uterine relaxation, right? Tocolysis. Yeah. Beta 2. Then beta 3 in the bladder, also bladder relaxation, right? So what allows us to hold on to urine or the bladder gets full is sympathetic. Beta 3, the bladder wall is relaxed, fills up with urine, right? Better. Okay. All right. And all beta receptors are going to be GS, right? Then we have alpha receptor. Alpha receptors are definitely innervated and mostly stimulated by norepinephrine as well as they can also be stimulated by epinephrine. Well, alpha 1 is what? Is GQ, right? And alpha 2 is what? GI. Right? Alpha 1 is GQ.
Yes, sir.
UI. So alpha 1 is GQ, alpha 2 is GI. All right. So GQ is what? What is the second messenger in GQ pathway?
GQ.
The GQ is the one that has the word phospholipase.
Phospholipase.
So we take PIP2 and phospholipase C cleaves PIP2 into what? IP3 and DAG. And IP3 we open what? Calcium channels, right? And that is a calcium influx. DAG will activate protein kinase C. Yeah. And calcium will bind to what? Camodulin, right? And form calcium camodulin complex. Calcium camodulin complex will activate myosin light chain kinase, which will phosphorylate myosin, the contractile protein, right, of smooth muscles, and that is what muscle contraction. Yeah. So that's how alpha 1 causes muscle contraction. So everywhere I say alpha 1, which is mostly on the smooth muscles of the vessels, smooth muscles of the uterus, right? Smooth muscles in the pupils, it's constricting, right? Or contracting those muscles rather. So it causes what? Vessel contraction or vessel constriction rather. It can cause uterine contraction. Yeah. Stuff like that. But it causes pupillary dilation, right? Not constriction, pupillary dilation. So that would be alpha 1 GQ.
Yes.
Alpha 2 is GI. What alpha 2 does, which is opposite of GS, right? Alpha 2 suppresses, right? Sympathetic tone. That's what it does. If you stimulate alpha 2, it's actually prevents, like an autoregulatory receptor. It's located on the neurons, sympathetic neurons, and it prevents them from releasing too much, right? Neurotransmitters. So whenever they release norepinephrine will go back and stimulate alpha 2, like a feedback inhibition, right? And suppress the release of more neurotransmitters, right? Yeah, than is needed, right? So it suppresses the sympathetic nervous system or sympathetic tone. So that would be alpha 2. Okay, right. And various drugs work on what? On these receptors, right? We have beta blockers. Yeah, we have beta agonists. And based on what they do, we can determine what we can use them for, which makes sense. Somebody has bradycardia, I can give them a beta 1 agonist, right, to increase the heart rate. Somebody is hypotensive, I can give what a beta 1 agonist to increase what cardiac output as well as activate RAS and bring up the blood pressure. If someone is has bronchoconstriction, I can give a beta agonist to stimulate beta 2 receptor and dilate, right, the airways. Yeah. If someone has urinary incontinence, urge incontinence, hyperactive bladder, I can give a beta 3 agonist to what? To relax, right? The bladder. Yeah. If a patient is hypotensive, I can give alpha 1 agonist to what? To constrict the vessels and bring the pressure up. Epinephrine and co. If a patient has increased sympathetic tone, maybe from suppressant withdrawal, alcohol withdrawal, or something, I can give like clonidine, alpha 2 agonist, right, to suppress, right, the sympathetic nervous system, things like that. Or somebody is hypertensive, give alpha 2 agonist also, suppress sympathetic tone, right, and stuff like that. There is hypertensive, I give alpha 1, dilate the peripheral vessels. There is hypertensive, I'm giving beta blockers, decrease cardiac output, decrease RAS, bring pressure down, right? So if you know their function, you can always go back and forth. Makes sense. All I just need to know is what the exact drugs, right, on each in each groups. Awesome.
Yes. Awesome.
All right. Back to the brain. What conditions have abnormal levels of catecholamines in the brain? Let's start first with what? Catecholamine, low catecholamine levels. What conditions I share with low catecholamine levels in the brain? Depression.
Yes.
Depression. Right? In depressed people, catecholamine levels are low in the brain. Epinephrine. Levels are low. No, it's one of those energy hormone, right? Fight or flight. Catecholamine means they provide us with the energy, they put us in a good mood, right? Fight or flight and stuff like that. And oh yeah, let me talk about anatomy first. Location, locus coeruleus, right? The cluster of neurons that usually make catecholamines, we call them locus coeruleus, right? In the brain, locus coeruleus, right? So low levels of catecholamine can be shared with what? With depression. Low levels catecholamine can be shared with depression, right? Depression. And that is why some of the drugs that we use to treat to treat depression, like metazapine blocks what? I think it blocks alpha 2 receptor. So that allows what? The neurons to keep releasing, right? More and more catecholamine. Drugs like the SNRIs, the duloxetine, serotonin, right? Norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor, they prevent reuptake of norepinephrine. That will increase the levels, right? In the synapse. And that helps, right? With depression.
Yes, sir.
Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. And when so low levels depression, high levels can be shared with what? Mania. Right. If levels are low, patient is depressed. If levels are too high, patient can be manic. Excellent. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Low levels in the reward center and concentration center, exactly, especially low levels in the mesolimbic system, concentration center, maybe I share with what? ADHD, right? Low levels, ADHD. And that's why we use drugs like what? Like stimulants, drugs that will increase catecholamine levels, methylphenidate, increase release of catecholamines, yeah, to treat ADHD. Does this make sense?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is what your exams will ask. Basics. All right. So those are catecholamines of significance. All right. Dopamine, almighty dopamine, right? Dopamine, beautiful hormone, high yield, very, very important, and very, very broad favorite. So let's start with anatomy. Where are the locations where we're going to see dopamines and talk a little bit about what it does in these locations? Of course, first of all, let me talk about receptors first, and then we'll talk about the locations. There are going to be two major dopamine receptors, D1, right, and D2. Those are the two major, right, dopamine receptors that you should know. Of course, there might be others, but for the board exam, D1, D2, you should know. D2 is G high.
Yes.
D1 is GX. Not G, I have one M and M. Yeah, GQs are have one M and M. Matus, right? D2, GI, right? Everything else would be right D1, right? So GS is D1. D1 is GX, right? D1 is GS. Dopamine. D1 is D1, which makes sense. D2 is GI, D1 is GS. They counteract, right? Each other. Okay. Locations of significance. There's dopamine, the word mesolimbic system. Dopamine, the mesolimbic system, where of course it controls the emotion, reward center, etc. Right? Yeah. So let's talk first. Let me put the mesolimbic. If dopamine level in the mesolimbic is too high, this is responsible for what? The positive symptoms of what? Of psychosis. Schizophrenia.
Yes, sir.
Right. Too much dopamine in the mesolimbic system. It's responsible for the positive symptoms of psychosis, hallucination, paranoia, delusion, right, etc. So that's mesolimbic. And also have dopamine in the reward center. Too much dopamine in the reward center may be responsible for addictive behavior, right? Addiction. And too little dopamine will result for ADHD, right? Right. The ADHD, the hyperactivity, right? Part of ADHD. Why the attention deficit part will lead to low catecholamines, right? In the concentration center. Or low dopamine in the reward center, result for the hyperactive side, right? Of ADHD. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Now, we also have dopamine where in the nigrostriatal pathway. Nigrostriatal. That is, we have what the substantial nigra in the midbrain, correct? Has dopaminergic neurons that extend their axons to where? To the basal ganglia, right? The putamen, the globus pallidus. Yeah. So, and the function of dopamine in this location is what? Is to what? Activate movement. So if dopamine is too high in this location, we're going to say what? Excess, right? Movement, hyperkinesis. If dopamine is too low in this location, we see what? Hypokinesis, decreased movement. Okay. So that's good.
Yes, so that's
okay. We also have dopamine where we have dopamine in the hypothalamus. The dopamine in the hypothalamus is for what? Temperature regulation. Temperature regulation. I'm going to tell you how that becomes important. Dopamine in the hypothalamus is for temperature regulation, usually for cooling off, right? And then we also have dopamine where in the tuberopituitary, right? Or tuberoinfundibulum. Basically, let's just say infundibulum of the pituitary gland. So pituitary gland, and the function of dopamine there is what? Is to decrease what? Decrease prolactin. Right? It inhibits prolactin release, right? Yeah, by stimulating D2 receptors on the prolactin secreting cells, lactotrophs. So that's good?
Yes, that's good.
Okay, so where's dopamine? Pituitary, decreased prolactin release. Mesolimbic system. If dopamine is so high in the mesolimbic system, it explains the positive symptoms of what? Psychosis. Increased dopamine in the reward system is explaining some of the addictive behaviors, right? Related to smoking and stuff like that. Low dopamine in the reward system, ADHD. High dopamine in the nigrostriatal pathway, excess movement. Low dopamine in the nigrostriatal pathway, hypokinesis, right? Rigidity, things like that. Hypo, in the hypothalamus, there's dopamine there, is relevant for temperature, right? Regulation. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Now, what conditions of significance are associated with? We already talked about some of them. Some of these, what pathways may share with some of these dysregulation of dopamine levels in this location. We already talked about some of them. We already mentioned ADHD. Yeah, we already mentioned addictive behaviors. But there's schizophrenia, right? Good, schizophrenia. Okay. And then we have excess dopaminergic activity, Huntington, right? Unopposed.
Yes.
And then Parkinsonism, right? Where there's low dopamine. Then there's a condition where the response to, then of course, we might see problem with pituitary prolactin and temperature as a result of the drugs we use, right? To treat or that targets dopamine. For instance, drugs that block dopamine receptors in the pituitary gland can lead to what? Hyperprolactinemia, right? Yeah, which can lead to galacturia, gynecomastia, and stuff like that, right? Yeah, hyperprolactinemia. If we're blocking, right, the receptor there, or if we block the dopamine receptor in the hypothalamus, it can lead to what? It can explain what? Neuroleptic malignant syndrome, right? Where patient has massively elevated body temperature, right? Yeah, with muscle rigidity and stuff like that. Yeah, they are taking antipsychotic. Excellent. So that's a good. Okay. So let's go into a little bit more details. Treatment. We know we just see the pathophysiology of schizophrenia. What would be my strategy for treating schizophrenia?
Decrease dopamine.
So we want to block dopamine receptors.
Yeah.
Yes or no?
Yes.
So antipsychotics are what? Are anti-dopaminergic drugs. At least to treat the positive symptoms, I need to block dopamine receptor where in the mesolimbic, right? System.
Yes.
Make sense? Yeah.
Yes, sir. Makes sense.
Under antipsychotics, we have what? We have our first generation, right? Antipsychotics, like alloperidol, right? We have second generation antipsychotics, like what the DONs, risperidone. And under second, we also have what, like the pins and what aripiprazole. So you have first gen, second gen. Under second gen, we have the DONs, like what risperidone, right? We have the pins or olanzapine, or clozapine, and then you have what aripiprazole. Right. And first gen example would alloperidol, right? Alloperidol, and others. What is unique? The first gen and the DONs, second gen DONs, like risperidone, they have what? Excess dopamine receptor blockade. Like they block dopamine receptor too much, not just in the mesolimbic system, they can block dopamine where in the pituitary gland and it's what hyperprolactinemia. Yeah, they can also block dopamine where in the nigrostriatal pathway. They block dopamine that can lead to what? Parkinsonism, right? Yeah, drug-induced Parkinsonism. They can block dopamine in the hypothalamus and lead to what? Neuroleptic malignant syndrome, right? As a side effect. Does that make sense? You are more likely to see those with what? With alloperidol and the DONs.
Right.
But the pins and aripiprazole, they modulate both what? Dopamine and serotonin. Because we're going to find out that what serotonin is responsible for what? For the negative symptoms. You got that? Serotonin is responsible for the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. What are the negative symptoms? Patient does not take care of themselves. Yeah. Body odor. They are not taking care of themselves. There is decreased affection, isolation, things like that. Those are negative symptoms. It's usually due to what? Abnormal, right? Serotonin levels in the brain.
Yes, sir.
So the pins and aripiprazole, they can modulate dopamine, sometimes as a partial antagonist, not full antagonist. So they have less movement side effects, less NMS, less hyperprolactinemia. Does that make sense? Yeah. And also modulate serotonin, right? So mostly modulate what? Both the negative and the what? Positive, right? Symptoms of psychosis.
Yes, sir.
And because of their effect on serotonin, that's why the pins, the major side effect will be what? Will be hyperphagia, people eating too much, gaining weight, sleeping too much, right? Hypertension, hyperlipidemia. They usually have metabolic-like syndrome or side effect because they're modulating, right? Serotonin with little effect on what? On dopamine, right?
Okay.
Good? Good?
Yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So that's super important. And yeah, so of course, this is why you're going to understand when you start clinical medicine or you're preparing for CCSE, you're going to understand why we usually use what the pins and aripiprazole as first line antipsychotics because they have less severe side effects, right? Compared to what alloperidol and the DONs, which can cause movement, right? Disorders, dystonia, all these kind of things.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so schizo. We already talked about Huntington, right? And it makes sense. In Huntington, there's an imbalance between GABAergic, right, and dopaminergic neurons. So in Huntington, we are using what? Drugs that auto antipsychotics, right, to block dopamine, right, where it did not go, right, striatal pathway,
Yes.
and prevent what? Hyperkinesis, right? In ADHD, where dopamine is low in the reward system, we give what? Stimulants. We treat with stimulants, right? Methylphenidate, which will increase what? The release of both dopamine and catecholamines, right? In these locations to what? Improve the reward, allow the patient to be able to take turns and decrease what? Hyperactivity.
Yes, sir.
Excellent. Good. In Parkinsonism, what would it do? Our goal is what? Increase what? Dopamine.
Yes.
Or block what? Inhibitory, right? Neurotransmitters like acetylcholine. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes.
So for Parkinsonism, increase what? Dopamine and or decrease what? Cholinergic activity. Because acetylcholine is what? Inhibitory. Dopamine is stimulatory. So the patient has hypokinesis, either I'm increasing dopamine to help with movement, or I block what acetylcholine, right? Yeah. So that's why we can use drugs like what, like the acetylcholine receptor antimuscarinic drugs, like what's the name? Benztropine, right, to treat Parkinsonism. Awesome, because that will block acetylcholine receptors.
Yes.
Now, how do you increase dopamine in the brain? What do we do to increase dopamine?
Well, we can either increase its release, I guess.
What do we do? How do you treat Parkinsonism, Parkinson's disease? What do we do then?
Carbidopa, levodopa.
Okay, so giving
There's a
why are you giving
pramipexole.
levodopa? What does levodopa do? Why do we give these people dopamine directly? Why can't we give dopamine in Parkinson? Why are you giving levodopa? And if you give levodopa, how would that become dopamine?
Okay, levodopa, that I think it has to be converted to the brain.
You said?
Levodopa has to be converted to dopamine, right?
What enzyme will convert levodopa to dopamine?
Oh my goodness.
So let me say this. Remember, can you see where I am right now on the whiteboard?
Yes, sir.
You can see where I am now?
Yes, I can.
Okay. If I give levodopa, right, to somebody, so let's say this is the blood-brain barrier. Blood-brain barrier. This is the peripheral circulation. And this is the brain. This is the BB. So when I give somebody levodopa, where would the drug end up first? In the peripheral circulation, right? First. It's not entering the brain directly initially. And what will happen to levodopa? Levodopa can be converted. We have enzymes in the periphery, right? Dopa decarboxylase enzyme. Decarboxylase enzyme that can convert what? Levodopa to what? Dopamine.
Yes.
Does it make sense? Levodopa to dopamine. The problem is if we have high dopamine in the periphery, can dopamine cross the blood-brain barrier? No, it can't. Does it make sense? This is useless. Dopamine cannot cross BBB. Levodopa can cross, right? Into the brain. Yes. So it's imperative that what most of the levodopa you give remain as what? As levodopa in the periphery, right? So that most of it will enter the brain and can help, right, with Parkinsonism.
Yes.
Do we agree? So far, so good? Okay. Another thing that can happen is, besides converting levodopa to dopamine in the periphery, we can also convert levodopa to what? To some end products, right? Yeah. We can to metabolites, right? Like VMA and whatnot. And the enzymes by what? Like COMT, right? Can do that. Also monoamine oxidase.
Yes.
Monoamine oxidase, right, can also do this and break down levodopa, break down dopamine, right, into like inactive metabolites for excretion out of the body. So what is important for us to do? We have to combine levodopa with drugs that can block decarboxylation, as well as drugs that can block what? COMT, right, and monoamine oxidase. So that most of the levodopa will remain as levodopa and it's going to enter, right, the brain as levodopa. Where we now want to convert to what? To dopamine, right? And then dopamine will stimulate what? The receptors, right? And help with the movement problem, right? In Parkinsonism. Does it make sense? Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
So what else do we combine with levodopa to prevent this peripheral conversion? Carbidopa. Right? Carbidopa will block what? Decarboxylase in the periphery.
Yes, sir.
And then we can also combine levodopa with the capons, right? Entacapon, which will inhibit, and there are also other capon, I think tolicapon. Some of them remain in the periphery, some of them can cross the brain also and prevent conversion of levodopa in the periphery to inactive metabolites. And I also have monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which can also work in the periphery as well as centrally, that are like seligenin, right? Seligeline and some other ones that will prevent the conversion, right, of levodopa to also inactive metabolites, right? Sometimes only in the periphery, sometimes both in the periphery and what in the brain.
Yes, sir.
But carbidopa should not be able to cross the brain, right? If carbidopa enters the brain, it's going to block this, and we don't want that because we want this step to take place, convert right levodopa towards dopamine for it to work in the brain. But we don't want it to do that in the what in the periphery.
Yes.
So excellent. So
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So these are the drugs we have to know what. Don't forget all these drugs and what they do or why we combine them. Super important.
Okay.
This and think about this. Imagine we don't combine levodopa with carbidopa or all these drugs. Not only will we see decreased activity in the brain or lack of improvement of symptoms, we're also going to see what dopamine will accumulate right in the periphery. And what is dopamine going to do? Dopamine is a vasodilator. It's going to dilate the vessels and can what things like orthostatic hypotension, right? As a side effect of levodopa.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yes, sir. Makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. But also, if levodopa enters the brain and there is a lot of levodopa in the brain, so I'm back up to dopamine. So if there's also a lot of levodopa in the brain and a lot of dopamine in the brain, and dopamine, instead of stimulating only nigrostriatal pathway, it stimulates what mesolimbic system, you might see what psychotic symptoms, right, as a side effect of what levodopa in patient with Parkinsonism. Okay, makes sense? You get it?
Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
Yeah. So all these, right, they're kind of interconnected. But the principle allows you, right, to kind of better understand the disease process, as well as what will be my strategy, right, for treating these conditions. And your exam will focus on mechanism. Even if I don't remember the drug name, know the drug's name as well as know the mechanism of the drugs, because that's what they're going to ask you. Mechanism. How does this drug cause this side effect? Things like that. By basically knowing where dopamine is and what it does in those locations, I can basically, right, make those conclusions easily.
Yes,
excellent.
sir.
Good.
Yeah.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
Now, serotonin. Serotonin is what? Is a happy hormone, right?
Yeah.
So, and serotonin too has a location. Locus coeruleus for catecholamines, Menet for acetylcholine. Serotonin is what? Dopamine for the I think addiction center for dopamine. They also call that the nucleus accumbens. In case you see that name, nucleus accumbens is dopaminergic neurons, reward center, addiction and stuff. Serotonin has a name. It has a location. Okay, Raphe, right? Nuclei of Raphe, right? Location, nuclei of Raphe, or serotonin. Yes, serotonergic neurons are usually considered the nuclei of Raphe. Yeah. So in the mesolimbic system, low serotonin is associated with what? Associated with depression. Low serotonin in the brain is associated with depression. May also explain some of the word negative symptoms, right? Negative signs and symptoms of psychosis. You get it?
Yes.
Low serotonin, we're seeing in depression as well as the negative signs and symptoms of psychosis. Too much serotonin, however, may trigger what manic episode, right? Mania, related to what bipolar, right? And stuff like that. So how do we treat depression based on this principle? What be our strategy for treating depression?
Increase serotonin.
We do it.
Increase serotonin.
We increase serotonin.
Yes.
So SSRIs, bupropion, metazapine, SNRIs, TCAs, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which will prevent the degradation of serotonin. Basically, tramadol, all those drugs, their job is to do what? Increase the levels of serotonin in the brain to help with depression, depressive symptoms. Yeah. If a patient with mania, however, or bipolar, however, takes a drug that increases serotonin, what would that do? That drug would trigger what? Manic episode.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Another thing serotonin does is, which explains why we might see some of the side effects. If excess serotonin can also what, it can lead to what? Sexual dysfunction. Right, which explains why SSRIs cause what? Sexual dysfunction as a side effect. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions on these neurotransmitters? What they do, where they are located, I'll share pathologies and the principle behind what the pharmacology of these conditions. Any questions? No? All right, that is good. All right. So going down. So let's talk about neuro micro.